You might well ask what on earth has inspired me, in 2026, to bother playing an ancient game based on a parodic superhero property that most people my age probably associate with a half-forgotten 90s cartoon. Well, the answer is simple. It's because of my other hobby, Magic the Gathering. The card game is currently years into a paradigm of crossover products, releasing an eye-watering amount of what it calls Universes Beyond sets and cards, featuring lots of other IPs reworked into Magic. It's a contentious business decision, to say the least, but one of the things I've personally enjoyed about it is the way it sometimes has worked to rekindle long-buried loves of certain franchises for me. Take today's subject, for example. In February of this year, Magic crossed over with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I'd not really thought about Turtles much in many years. In fact, the only real engagement I'd had with the franchise for a long time was reading the absolutely fantastic comic The Last Ronin. However, back in a youth spent buried in comics and watching cartoons, TMNT was definitely one of my loves, in part because of the jokes at the expense of the dark age of comics, but also because it's an utterly bonkers franchise with some of the weirdest and wackiest lore you're likely to see. You're listening to the almighty Backlog. I'm Ellie, and today's review is on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, available for Amiga, Amstrad CPC, Atari ST, Commodore 64, MS-DOS, MSX, the NES, PlayChoice 10 and the ZX Spectrum. This review is based on the NES version of the game. Developed by Konami and published jointly by Konami, Ultra Games and Palcom depending on region and version. The genre is action-adventure, and How Long to Beat has an average playtime of about 3 hours. For the uninitiated, not to mention those who've not spared a thought for Turtles in the last 20 or so years, the franchise is a long-running set of superhero stories about the titular reptiles. Created in the early 80s by artists Eastman and Laird for their newly minted Mirage Studios, the story was originally conceived as a riff on what the pair thought were the overly serious and grim aspects of the graphic novel scene at the time. If you know your comic history, by this point the industry had begun a dark reinvention, with a profusion of gritty superhero stories and origins. In particular, Eastman and Laird were inspired by Marvel's Daredevil, going so far as to set their comic in the same rough area of New York, and even using a spoof of Daredevil's origin story. You might already know how that goes. 4 pet turtles accidentally get splashed with radioactive ooze, mutating them into anthropomorphic forms. The quartet escape into New York's sewer system, where they grow up under the care of Master Splinter, a similarly mutated elderly rat. Splinter trains the brothers in the ancient arts of ninjutsu, gifting each of them a special weapon and tasking them with defending New York from the villainous Foot Ninja Clan and their terrifying leader, the Shredder. The series was phenomenally popular and catapulted the Turtles to the state of household names. Apart from lengthy comic series, the brand expanded to include cartoons, some of which I remember watching, films, some animated, some featuring actors in rubber suits, and at least 2 horrendous-looking Michael Bay-produced affairs, toys, and of course video games. As is my wont, it's the video games that particularly interest me. By the time that TMNT got its first games, it was the late 80s, and Turtles was enjoying a stunning period of popularity. 1987 saw the release of the first animated cartoon based on the franchise, which remains one of the most well-loved renditions of it on the small screen. And it's no surprise really that it would be adapted into game form, both for the arcades but also for the home consoles. Enter Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, a 1989 release for a plethora of systems but perhaps most notably the NES, which looked to adapt the cartoon and bring the Turtles' conflict with the Foot Clan to life. How well it did so is a matter of some debate. If you're of an age similar to mine, and if you also had a youth as willfully misspent on mid-2000s internet, you may well have found out about this game due to angry video game reviewers, much as I did. I think the TMNT games were a relatively early AVGN review. Regardless of when it was, I can still quite clearly remember his typical profanity-laden, mouth-frothing ranting about this game in particular. Now, obviously the angry game review scene was merely a bunch of characters played very, very larger than life, but the responses to this game were built up in response to a very real, very challenging level of difficulty. I shouldn't be surprised that it's a tough game. This was, after all, the era well known for overly difficult to the point of unfair games, as developers wrestled with both the move from the arcades to home consoles and with the prevalence of game rentals. It does feel like a notably laborious game to play, mind. While I don't profess to have a full understanding of how hard the NES library is in a broad sense, I do at least feel comfortable saying that beating this game was not easy. The main point of comparison I suppose I have is Ninja Gaiden, but it's not exactly similar to that game in terms of its design. Actually, TMNT is difficult in some ways that feel almost unique. Let's start with the way the game actually works. From screenshots that I'd seen of this game, I assumed that it was mainly going to be a side-scrolling action game, not unlike Ninja Gaiden or Castlevania. That's only partially true, however. There are indeed plenty of side-scroller levels, but this game also features an extensive amount of top-down exploration, the Legend of Zelda style. What's really intriguing is that both of these contribute to the overall difficulty of the game in different ways, combining to produce a truly arduous experience. The game begins with Turtles' ally April O'Neil kidnapped by Shredder's forces, held by his enforcers Bebop and Rocksteady. The goal of the first main stage then is pretty clear cut. The brothers need to find and rescue her. As is the way NES games were, you're then plonked down in New York with no real guidance available to you. On the pause screen, you can sometimes get a brief one-line description of your goal, but mainly things are left to the player to simply figure out. There's an argument in favour of this kind of design, of course. Some players love the freedom of a game world opening up with little in the way of hand-holding. It's not necessarily my favourite way to play a game, but I can see the appeal. The issue I find with TMNT is that the life-based game economy leading to full game restarts means you can find progress quickly wiped out. Finding April is easier said than done. The top-down overworld features a metric ton of buildings and sewers, which each have their own bespoke, short, side-scrolling stage in them. Many of them have absolutely no value to you, containing little more than pickups or are simply pathways to other parts of the overworld. But a few will contain either items vital for progress or the goal of the level. Which ones are they? Who knows? You'll just have to amble slowly around and check out every doorway available, fight through the crowd of enemies that bar the way inside, and then hope at the end there's something useful. If not, you're out of luck and almost definitely down some hit points. Oh, did you not remember to bring along some way of noting that door is no use to you? Whoops. Better pause the game and go get a pen and paper, me old mucker, because this game will not track that for you. Once you've figured out the path to rescue April and, not died along the way, you finally move along onto stage 2, an infamously unforgiving water level involving electric killer seaweed in the Hudson River. As you do. This and the final stage are, comparatively speaking, relatively short and linear, but around them are a series of stages more like the first, each one featuring an extensive overworld and multiple pathways to explore. The level to which TMNT is a labyrinth is, I think, a large part of why this game has a reputation for being so hard. It's tough to make progress when the way forward with the plot is obscured by finding the correct path to it, and it makes dying and resetting feel like an even heavier punishment. Of course, it's no cakewalk when you get into the side-scroller stages either. For a start, although you can play as any of the turtles, that's Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo and Donatello for the unaware, and each one is armed with their own signature weapon, a katana, paired sai, nunchaku and a bow staff respectively, most players agree that of the four, only Donatello is any good. This is because his attack, in which he awkwardly jabs his staff forward in front of him, is the only one in the game with any range. This is vital because the enemies swarm and rush at you in such a ludicrous volume that it would make Ryu from Ninja Gaiden blush. The chances of avoiding damage are slim indeed, as the enemies in TMNT run the gamut of annoying NES-era baddie designs. There's a ton of them, they respawn incredibly quickly, many of them rip your health to bits, and a bunch of them either move weirdly or are generally hard to hit. When one of the brothers falls in battle, the game's not over. Instead, you switch to one of the remaining turtles, and the defeated one is captured by the Foot, spirited away to a location somewhere in one of the levels accessed via the overworld. That means if you want to be at full strength, you're going to have to spend yet more time trawling the buildings and sewers of New York looking for them, and you're probably going to want to do that because taking on these stages is hard enough, but trying it without Donatello is practically asking to have a game over. It probably feels a little like I'm labouring the point, but something I try and make clear when I play many of the NES-era titles is that these games genuinely were just really difficult, and that it manifests in a very different way to how we are accustomed to challenge these days. TMNT and games like it prioritised rote repetition, expecting players to fail and fail a lot, each time hopefully having either learned a bit more about the game's layout or getting more practiced at knowing and defeating level enemies. The problem I have with TMNT is that frankly it's just too much all at once. The multiple sprawling overworlds, the number of different stages to explore, and the barrage of enemies adds up to a game that tips past the balance of hard but fair and into tiresome. There are still some major stages afterwards, and that the game's difficulty and enemy density only increases serves not to entice me with challenge, but to bore me with the effort expended. And yet, I would be lying if I said I wasn't at least a little bit impressed by TMNT. It's the ambition that gets me, you know? I've played plenty of bad games, but in my experience, the ones I dislike the most are those that are either plain offensive or simply don't try. A boring game always feels worse than a game that trips trying to do something cool. And make no mistake, what TMNT was trying to do here was cool. The idea of cramming in multiple overworlds, each with a huge array of different levels that transition the game from top down to side scroller, is a wild thing to see on the NES. I mean, sure, Zelda 2 did it first, but I still think TMNT deserves props for giving it a go in an age of simpler games. That's what stuck with me most after slogging through it and finally beating the game. The journey wasn't fun, not by a long shot. It was arduous, repetitive, and far too overly unforgiving for my tastes. In a way, I'd have been happier had the game simply been a side-scroller, just letting me beat stuff up as the turtles. And I think that message was understood in its time as well, given that later Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle games changed to be beat-em-ups instead. But this game's heart and style are worthy of respect regardless. In my mind, it's on the shelf next to Zelda 2 and Castlevania 2, a place for games that aren't terribly fun to play but have a special shine all of their own for daring to try something new and ambitious. Regardless, the final score is 2 out of 7. Poor. A disappointment. Don't bother with this unless you're desperate for a bad time. This has been Ellie on the Almighty Backlog. You can support this project by reading the review over on thealmightybacklog.wordpress.com or by listening to the pod review hosted on RSS and YouTube. Please feel free to follow me over on Mastodon, Blue Sky and/or Backlogged by following the links on the blog. If you'd like to support the show financially, you can do so by donating via PayPal to thealmightybacklog@gmail.com or by hitting the donate button on the blog. Thanks for listening, and have a lovely day.